So that was an interesting um, trip down memory lane, looking at the that PDF. Um, a lot of things, conceptually, a lot of things are the same, but I agree that energy is different, um, and it's a different kind of game for sure than the one I've been currently working on.
Now, there are plenty of things that I don't think is fair to call cringy in the procedures. But and I'm not talking about the setting, I'm talking about the actual procedures. But they are
Mhm.
definitely um probably nothing that you really need to, preserve. But there's something
Right.
about them that I do think is absolutely worth returning to.
Okay.
And that is uh the impact, the how am I going to put it, the magnitude of the effect of dice outcomes. Things
Okay.
actually happen when the dice hit the table. Things occur,
Right.
and the let's see, you have this notion of, okay, I'm trying to work through kind of your long ago heavy explanatory prose,
Right. Right.
but the so you've got this kind of interesting thing of investment. You've got rolling initiative, and then you're pulling these fortune tokens.
Right.
And then in the contests themselves, now the precise details don't really matter that much, but what I want to focus on um, is what kind of improvements we're talking about when we're all done. Um,
Okay.
one of them, I mean, it's just basically standard improvement, and that's where I think things get a little bit tricky because there's this whole business about legacies, right? How do you get your legacy pumped up? And
Right.
so if we turn our attention to that, we turn our
Okay.
attention to this legacy issue. So here you've got sort of a primitive thing where you get these fortune tokens and you can either blow them in play for bonuses or you can build up your character to be tougher. And that's a long-standing tradition that is surprisingly difficult to do well in design.
Yeah.
So if you sort of dial that back and say let's turn it all over, let's turn it over and do legacy as the thing that we're interested in changing, right? We're
Okay.
interested in legacy occurring, right? So we're going to take,
Yes.
right. So let's just go ahead
Yeah.
and write down the word legacy, and we're going to figure out a way for it to go up. In what ways? In looking at the energy of this and looking at some of your thoughts since then,
Mm.
how does legacy go up?
I just like see it. Um, I would think um, that legacy would go up, and I don't want to get off track or jargony, with not necessarily a meaning. I guess maybe a meaningful conflict, but a significant conflict.
Okay.
Um, so
So
um,
some conflicts can make,
merely,
okay, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, just as an example, merely uh, fighting off bandits to save the village would be fine, but that's not going toward your legacy. Defeating the bandit leader or routing the bandits entirely, something bigger, something significant would add to legacy.
A term that I've been using a lot is situation.
Yeah.
And in the class that I'm teaching, um, or one of the classes I'm designing, which is after the introductory class, really digs into it and says a situation is what we always have. You may or may not have a setting
Right.
per se, in the sense of detailed information and maps and things like that.
Okay.
You may have that kind of hand wavy thing. Oh, there's a setting out there and it kind of smells like this, but that's all we know,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or you may have um how am I going to put it? You're always going to have scenes in play by definition. The question is whether you're going to have designated scenes as meaningful units of mechanics changing, things, right? Like
Right.
in Star Trek Adventures, there's this thing called a scene, and at the end of a scene, one of your existing momentum, if you have any, decays.
Yeah.
So when you go to the next scene, you'll have one less momentum in your bank if there was any in the first place. Okay, so there
Right.
has to be a scene transition, if nothing more than the GM just reaching out and pulling out the momentum and throwing it away.
Right.
Right. So there's
Um,
here's my point. You may not have formalized scenes of that kind. You may or may
right.
not. So you may or may not have formalized scenes. You may or may not have formalized setting. Both of those could be left just squishy for talking. But
Right.
situation is not squishy. It is never squishy. It cannot be squishy.
Right.
Period. And the question is whether the mechanics of play have any power to change situations. One
Okay.
would think they absolutely would. But then you look at a lot of role playing games and you realize that the players are basically busy a lot, but there is no known way by which they change the situation except by simply according with specific milestones that the GM may have in mind at
Right.
most, right? So the what I will think of that is I'm beginning to call that Jesus is coming, look busy role playing.
That makes sense.
Right? The situation changes as the GM sees fit based on what's happened, but there's really no way for you to do it. In other
Yeah.
words, there's no involuntary pressure that is placed on the game master based on what we have done. Right? The
Right.
situation
Right.
doesn't change either sequentially or at the end of play. I don't care which or both. To go back to Star Trek Adventures, if we accumulate enough momentum and spend it on an advantage, which is basically a way or a complication for the enemy, we can make a specific foe or circumstance later have a higher difficulty in its rolls by using momentum now.
Yeah.
We can
Right.
give ourselves like a higher defense in some aspect of our ship or something like that against that, for that foe's attacks by spending momentum now. There's nothing the game master
Right.
can do about it. He can't say, "Oh, you can't do that. My guy has to be strong."
Right.
No, can't do it.
Yeah.
Right. To do that, we're going to have to give the game master threat, and the game master can spend it the way they want to. But
Yeah.
that's the only way. So, in other words, the game master has to accept situational changes based on what the players do. Now,
Correct.
it doesn't always have to be as uh, formalized or quantitative as that. But
Yeah.
the question always remains: in a game of the kind we're talking about here, in many particulars, in fact, it becomes an absolutely critical question to say in the situation, which I think you'll understand is the situation in which we have scenes
Yes.
and of which is part of the setting, right?
Right.
But so of that situation, what can the players change that is basically their right to change, their capacity to do so in a fashion that is non-negotiable. If they do this, that, and the other, it's non-negotiable. If we go to BX, if we go to Moldve, as written, what is their capacity to do that? And I can think of a couple things. Not much, but a couple things.
Oh, let's see. That's a good question, actually. I feel like I failed Bible study now. Um, Oh no, nothing specifically comes. I mean, you can kill the creature, but that's not what we're talking about here.
It depends on the
Um,
creature. That
yeah,
depends a little bit partly on situational
right.
concept, which we'll get to. So that's one thing, right? The
Yeah.
one thing I can really truly think of is we extract that treasure. Those treasures,
Um,
particularly the biggies, right? The
right,
big ones, the cool
right.
ones. They change hands. Thank you.
That's true.
And there's
Right,
nothing the game master can do. DM cannot say, "Oh, by the way, you can't have that."
right.
No, excuse me. We get that,
Yeah, that
right?
belongs to us now.
Yeah. And another thing we could talk about is that there is a dial which is clearly clicked very definitely per module of that exact game of Dungeons and Dragons. Not
Right.
so much in the AD&D, if you ask me, but very much
Yeah.
so in Moldvay, is that if you take a given published scenario, you can very clearly see whether the players are empowered to change the situation or not. It almost
Right.
literally says so every single time. That's the and so that's something that we're looking at here. Clearly, here there are times when the characters have the ability to change the situation. They just do.
Right. And I
Um,
and I think that that is the intent was the intention, even if it wasn't consciously the
mhm,
intention.
mhm. That's
Uh,
what I
I
was
think that
thinking.
is
Yeah. So I'm
yeah,
trying to articulate what you said about the bandit leader.
yeah,
Right. So there are things that are now there are a couple of ways to do it. You could have it be Easter eggs scattered through a situation. So if
right,
they happen upon it, right, then they're able to do it. Or if they work their way up to the boss. I mean, it's sort of the boss fight concept is a very lame-brained version of this notion, right?
right, yeah,
So if we, but it's not too much better to sort of scatter stuff at random and they can run into stuff and it doesn't mean much. But then if they run into this other stuff, then oh, you uncovered the right rock. You know this.
right,
This matters. And so instead, we have a um, there's also the dynamic method, which is basically the game master has this many danger points, and when you run them out of danger points, then you've done enough, right? No matter how they
right,
got run out, but they've been run out, and so basically your your adversity is out of gas, and now you just wrap it up some way,
yeah,
to say so. None of these are good or bad in and of themselves. Some of them are overly familiar, but they. The question is here, especially because you've got a mechanic, you've got a thing, you've got the character's scroll.
mhm,
What do we see that? And you see, this is why we need to go to situational prep. We're not going
yeah,
to situational prep just to find out to be how as entertaining as you can possibly be. We're doing situational prep because we actually have our eyeballs on how do I make my legacy go up? And which is to say, how do we prepare situations so that it is capable of change in an understood fashion?
right,
And that,
and that can intersect with multiple legacies. Although
sure. Well, that's an interesting point
yeah,
about legacies. Um, I really should dig it up to find the precise rules, but in my superhero stack over there, um, Marvel Universe is worth looking at here. In Marvel
okay,
Universe, whenever you do a thing, I think you write it down as a sentence. And
right,
it may be with every successful roll, or maybe it's less formalized than that. But you write stuff down, and sometimes I think it's just a catchphrase, right? You said a cool thing, and let's not call it a catchphrase. You said a cool thing, and you
yeah,
liked it, right? You
right,
said, "Ooh, I was kind of smart right there in role playing. I nailed it. I'm going to write that down." So you do that, but at the end of the session, you can only keep one or two of these.